Machines That Fail Us, a podcast by the Human Error Project at the University of St. Gallen about the human rights implications of AI, errors and failures, and our future with artificial intelligence. Welcome to the fourth episode of Machines That Fail Us. My name is Philippe Di Salvo. I'm a researcher at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, a member of the Human Error Project research team, and the host of this podcast series. The Machines That Fail Us podcast aims at answering one question. What are the implications of AI errors for society, and what do they tell us about our future with artificial intelligence? In the previous episodes, we discussed where our research project has brought us in the analysis of AI errors, the role of journalists in responsibly covering artificial intelligence, and how civil society organizations are fighting for algorithmic justice. This episode, together with the next and final one, will be instead focused on how to build alternative AI futures. Today, in particular, we will discuss how to at least try to imagine a different artificial intelligence model and future, and what is needed to achieve this goal. The one you're listening to is an episode about imagination and a bit of future making. I anticipate this to you. Yet, we are definitely not providing predictions or easy answers to complex questions about artificial intelligence. In this episode, we will talk about how going beyond binary utopian versus dystopian and Western-centric vision of AI and technology in general is absolutely necessary today to build a different discourse and a new techno-culture around the AI and our future with this technology. I am extremely happy to have this conversation with one of the most engaged academics dealing with these issues. But before we start, an announcement, and please save the date. On June 24th, we will host the Machines That Fail Us conference, a one-day event taking place at Square at the University of St. Gallen. The event will discuss the topics we have talked about in this podcast with the aim of building a public debate about AI errors, their human rights implications, and our democratic futures. The event is free to everyone, and we will host 2 workshops, a keynote speech, and an expert discussion panel. For all the details, see the University of St. Gallen event page. And please, see you there. Now, let's go back to our podcast episode of today. For this episode of Machines That Fail Us, I'm extremely happy to be joined by Professor Payal Arora, a professor of inclusive AI cultures at Utrecht University and the co-founder of FemLab, a feminist futures of work initiative. Professor Arora is a digital anthropologist and an author, speaker and consultant. Her new book, titled From Pessimism to Promise, will be published in early September by MIT Press. Without any doubt, Professor Arora is also one of the most interesting voices now discussing the future of artificial intelligence. Professor Arora, it's a great pleasure to have you with us on Machines That Fail Us today.
Thanks for having me here.
Most of this episode will be about the future. The first question I want to ask you is actually about the present. So, in your view, how is the building of artificial intelligence progressing nowadays? And are expectations being met? And what is not going well in terms of equity, fairness, or inclusion, for instance?
Look, every technology will always have a future or speculative future. So it's how we imagine technologies to be, oftentimes based on our prior experiences. But also, we are human beings with which basically means that we exercise our imagination to its fullest. So it is a culture of fear that is really fostered about how AI and other such technologies are going to create extinction, war, social isolation, as well as on the other hand, that it creates a sort of solves our problems, and particularly chronic issues, whether it's to do with inequalities, the climate crisis. So it's basically we put much of our hopes, our fears, and in its extremities onto technologies. And I think it is well worth reminding ourselves that technologies are sort of mirroring the complexities of society. And as people, we need to move ahead and try to align it with values that we can hold dear. So, so yeah, that's a long story short to really emphasize that when we speak about the progress of technologies, we are basically looking at a linear perspective as if it moves from point A, which is supposedly either, if you take it from a pessimistic angle, it's basically, oh, the good old days where technology was simpler and worked for us, to these kind of technologies like AI where we've completely lost control over it, right? And or you're in a sort of hyper optimistic, techno optimistic perspective where finally we have these technologies that are going to make our life so much more better, but actually it's going to happen both in tandem, right? And so let us move away from the progressive conversation and situate more in terms of that it is a relationship with these tools. And just like all relationships, it requires nurturing, investment. It requires being open and being cognizant about what constitutes as a healthy relationship. And this is what we should really aim for, is what is a healthy internet for today and for the future.
And the Human Error Project, where this podcast has been generated, and the podcast itself are about analyzing the importance and relevance of the errors of artificial intelligence. So, for instance, biases, discriminatory outcomes, and various failures that these systems have already shown to us. So, in your views, how do AI errors interconnect with this kind of interplay you were mentioning? And what do they tell us about the artificial intelligence we are actually building at the moment?
Yeah, so as you well know, there's a lot of conversation about how algorithms are racist, sexist, basically how these platforms are oppressive and are really like extractive, colonial. So this is a very heavy discourse we're immersed in right now. And I basically push against that. And the reason is that we basically are essentializing technologies, and it is much of a mirror of the way in which we engage with today. When we do not like a particular outcome, say you communicate to me and I don't like what you said, I accuse you personally of being a particular entity, right? And rather than focusing on that specific outcome and saying that is not the outcome which is desirable, it is that outcome specifically is racist, is sexist, right? And so I think with technologies, particularly with AI, it's made up of data sets which are obviously biased, because data is a reflection of our biases. There's no such thing as a ground zero biased social life. We all can do our best to be unbiased. That doesn't mean that we should give up. Obviously, we need to strive towards a more fairer and equitable future, and especially because the past has numerous amounts of injustice, which has been sort of translated into the majority of data that we have. So, for example, much of our data is, and we know this for a fact, is collected and reflects the interests of a minority of the people in the world today. People like, there's a term called weird, which is, it's really reflective of Western, educated, industrialized, democratic societies. So that's one sort of a sort of group that is reflected, or it is, oftentimes white males in the West. So we can come up with a variety of things, and it's completely legitimate. But that being said, is that these tools, if we essentialize them, we have given up our power to control them, to guide them, and to retrain them in ways that will work for us, particularly as we give thought to the kind of guardrails that need to be around it. So I think it is really well worth reminding ourselves that these platforms are also enabling, because these very platforms have fostered the global movements from Me Too to Black Lives Matter. So how do we sort of compute these supposedly disparate and contradictory things. Are they racist or are they enabling? They're both, obviously. We just need to ensure that they are enabling far more towards not just our social well being, but also our planetary well being. And if we keep at it, we will make a little better system than that was yesterday. And that's how we go about it, is incremental and try to push it forward one step at a time.
And well, I had the privilege of having a kind of anticipated read of your forthcoming book, From Pessimism to Promise, which is mostly focused on an approach that stresses the importance of looking beyond Western views and ideas about technology that, as you said, it's now still central. But for too long and still today, technology appears to be based mostly by the West, with the West in mind. You mentioned this already, but is this happening with AI already, and why is it problematic? So someone is definitely being left behind in this conversation.
Well, actually, on one hand, yes, a lot of, like, whether it's OpenAI and other initiatives, there is a lot of momentum happening, say, from Silicon Valley, and oftentimes they, move fast and break things logic has led to this deep arrogance, right? Where they went ahead and knowingly broke a lot of rules, particularly using proprietary information and patented information, which has resulted in many lawsuits. So, of course, there are a lot of issues, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? And not to forget how they have shifted from being a public organization to a private sector, which is also a tactical, approach for. And by the way, why it is connected to the global south, because this is a pattern which we have seen play out time and again, where in the name of altruism, Silicon Valley, who has, of course, taken on the mantle of being the gurus for AI for good, go out to the world, say, hey, we want to make the world a better place. So we're not doing a private sector thing. It's an altruistic thing. So we can circumvent net neutrality, just like Facebook Free Basics did, or we can circumvent like GDPR, just like WorldCoin, which is Sam Altman's prior company that was supposed to give the benefit of, Bitcoin-like entities to the world, particularly the global south, took indiscriminate amounts of data from a lot of global south countries and then built their tools and then declared bankruptcy and uses their data now for a private company. Now, this is a tactic that has been played again and again. That being said, okay, and so the reason I bring this up is I am well aware of what is going on, that I am still optimistic. Why? Because the times have changed. The global south is no longer a post-colonial nation in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. They have a lot of confidence. 90% of young people live outside the West, so they have the demographics, they have the youth dividend. They've finally come online in the last decade. Majority of them have come online because of extraordinarily affordable data plans and mobile phones. They're extremely enthusiastic about digital media because they can create alternative job opportunities. They can really carve a space for themselves. So, and not to forget, they are not also just following the West and using Western tools. There's a lot of indigenous applications. In fact, for example, India has, and this is just one of the many examples I bring out in the book, India has built the largest digital public infrastructure in the world. And that should have come from Europe, right? Basically, what this is doing is it is allowing the market to be competitive and pushing against the tech monopolies, right? Because you have iOS and Android becoming the mafia of taking a cut every time you become an entrepreneur. So it's like this kill zone around innovation. What India has done is kill that opportunity, where in many ways, by allowing any young entrepreneur to just set up shop by getting onto this digital public infrastructure, which is open source, open access. Another major thing happening in young African countries, as well as in South Asia, where majority of the population lies, is that they are finally able to create content in multiple languages and dialects and accents, which is enabling inclusion in ways that is unprecedented, to information, to networks, to opportunities, and in an extremely affordable way, because it was absolutely unfeasible. And it is well worth remembering, we are talking about in India alone, there's 22 regional languages and thousands of dialects. And don't get me started on accents. And and this is allowing them to leapfrog, even if you're semi-literate, right? You're able to leapfrog and access this through this audiovisual content. So there's a lot of energy, and this is why there's so much optimism, because the leapfrogging is key to many of these countries which feel that finally we have a chance of getting included in these opportunities. We have finally a chance in being seen and heard. And this is something we cannot undermine, because we are coming from a position of privilege where we take it for granted.
Yeah.
Because we are part of that 5% of liberal democracies, which don't question these sort of stable institutions and access to media in our comfort languages, which is, underlined, and we see it and recognize it around us.
And do you think that in the West there is a real perception that this movement is going on? Or are we listening? That's the question I would like to ask you, to what is being pushed forward in other parts of the world.
Well, I think what's happening is that they're slowly beginning to listen. So, for example, I feel, so I'm situated in academia. Academia is still very siloed, and it goes back into disciplines. And this is why, like, say, for example, in the humanities, we are fostering a culture of fear, because we are so look at who's publishing all these fear-based conversations of almost like deterministic doomsday discourses.
Yeah.
And it's coming from those, particularly in the West, particularly in the humanities. It's not coming from business school, it's not coming from medical economics, it's not. So there's that sort of lens that we still hold on to, this old-fashioned trope. And oftentimes it is not, they clearly look at the rest of the world as victims. And it's almost like this reverse, like we were the colonizers, now we need to fix it. And it's still lying in a sort of condescending way that lies in the hands of the West, that we innovate in the West and we disseminate to the rest, either that through altruism or through a paternalistic attitude. And I think there's very little room for imagination that, hey, guess what? Maybe we can actually be co-creators. Maybe we can learn from the global South, because they managed to, not just be optimistic, they actually doing concrete things to leapfrog. Like, I'm going to China in a few days, and they are way ahead in fintech in ways that they barely use cash. And if you go to Germany or the United States, it is a complete chaos when it comes to mobile payments. And it is still backward. I think that is really disruptive of people's mindset about the rest of the world, because they think that they still should be following. So you may really want to be the person who does good, and you really want to help out the rest of the world, but actually they're not waiting for you to help them. They want to tell you, hey, get on board, because we've been using digital payments for the last decade and a half, and it's a pain in the neck to come to your country because you want us to pay in cash and you want us to, use these old technologies, and that is really crazy for them, So I think there's a certain humility that needs to be learned today, which allows for a much more productive relationship with the global South. Because guess what? We have some bigger fish to fry. We have the climate crisis. We have global inequality. We need financial reform. We need to work together. And it doesn't matter where the ideas are coming from, right? So we need to get everyone on board who's ready to engage and who's ready to, of course, be in alignment with our social values of democracy, of course, for this to work.
And the point of pessimism is also central to your latest book, which there is what I call a cheap pessimism, which is dominant in the West, to say everything is doomed, everything is apocalyptic, which is a very kind of easy way of framing issues like biases, etc., what were really there. And this is, of course, also connected with all the fuss around existential risk, the catastrophic takes on AI, which makes very little sense, but are still dominating. So, why do you think this is the case in the West? Why we ended up believing either techno utopianism or this kind of doomerism that makes also little sense? And there is a quote in the book that I really liked, which says, "Pessimism is a privilege for those who can afford to live in despair, but the rest of the world has little choice but to be optimistic, as the future depends on it," which I think takes a great picture of the issue. But why are we, in a sense, stuck in believing in this kind of almost science fiction takes on AI still?
I think is people, particularly who I call doomsday divas, who are perpetuating this culture of fear, are people in very privileged positions who like the status quo. Because for them, social media is a hindrance. It's tedious, right? Anyone who's really, really perpetuating them see what kind of platforms they have. They have public platforms. They have probably a lot of followers. They are in, liberal democracies. They are highly educated, right? And even if they're people of color, they have positions where people are listening to them. So it is a conversation that, by the way, cognitively gets more attention, because when you perpetuate fear, our brain pays more attention to it than when you perpetuate stories of, happiness. And this is scientifically proven. And so it is a cheap trick, which is why, even media headlines really gets, more clicks. It's a sort of clickbait perpetuated by the intelligentsia. But I find it to be not just irresponsible, but very dangerous.
Yeah.
Because we cannot afford to be in that state, because it dismisses the majority of the world who are optimistic because they have to be. They're rational optimists because they recognize that, look, you have, firstly, here's a position is that we do not glorify the status quo, because the status quo is not working out for majority of the people on the planet, right? So what are you trying to hold on to, right? You're in a position of war. Many of the countries have deep inequality. If you look at where the youth are living, which is, majority of it in the global south, something like 60 to 80% in some parts of Africa don't have jobs. This is something serious. They are going to be at the forefront of the climate crisis. So for them, they're not like saying, oh, let's keep the status quo. No, they want anything that will get them out of there. And guess what? Any new innovation gives them a glimpse of hope that maybe we can try this out. Because surely a new tool can recalibrate and also shift power relations. Because what happens with new technologies is that it has a potential to disrupt the existing power relations. And those doomsday divas are very much on the side who enjoys this kind of power. And so, of course, they're reluctant to let it go, consciously or subconsciously. And so I think it's, for me, coming now from a point of, pushback in a hard way, because I'm done with being pessimistic. I'm done with this culture of fear, because it's really creating a hindrance for things which should be productive. Let's all get on board. Let's identify the problems. Let's identify the issues, and let's move forward. Because guess what? We have a lot of work to do. And I think there's a future, because of course there has to be, right? And how else can you approach living? Then you might as well not live.
Yeah.
Right? So,
And then I'm also thinking this veil of pessimism also obscures a rational conversation we could have on the technology. So we know that there are issues with AI, and they're serious, and they're already making some people's life may worse, but it's not what the gurus or the entrepreneurs or the Silicon Valley is saying. But kind of the debate is being built on what they say, and so also rational analysis is also being completely put aside, even in the West.
absolutely. And look, the irony is the people who are hypercritical about any of these new technologies are the ones who actually have a deep skill set to look into the flaws behind these technologies and have the position to basically be useful.
Yeah.
Because in highlighting the issues which can create harms and risks, right? But they're the very people who are not engaging with the digital entrepreneurs, the technology companies, because they don't want to be tainted with being collaborators, or shall we say, being complicit in the algorithms of oppression, or being complicit in surveillance capitalism. So in short, if they are not part of the conversation, then are they surprised that these people in the tech industry and elsewhere are proceeding ahead without that kind of insight? And this to me is the most frustrating part, because I think it's deeply irresponsible, to not be part of that conversation. And I get it. You don't want to be usurped and used by tech companies to rationalize and, the sort of like a washing of the ethics washing or whatnot. But then you set the grounds of the rule, I mean,
Yeah.
the rules of the game, right? And move forward. So I think there are ways to go about it, which can be thoughtful engagement. And most importantly, there are always good people in bad systems.
Yeah.
We have to understand that, right? Whether it's in the government, whether it's in technology companies, because they are made up of human beings, and we cannot assume that all people in these institutions are people who really want to destroy the planet, destroy people. No, many of them are like you and I. It's a job. They want to feel like they're on the right side. They want to feel like they're doing something right. And in fact, they've spoken up and pushed back against innovations, whether it's happened in Google or elsewhere. We see this, which is a reminder that because these institutions are made of people, there is hope. Because people want to generally, be on the right side of history, right side of things. And we just have to create that pathway where we can co-create what these futures look like, right?
In trying to imagining what our AI futures may look like, in the book you propose a way forward, which is also something you don't usually get in techno criticism, let's say this way. And you say that the future of AI needs to be manual, material, and multicultural. And I would like to ask you, what does this entail, and what's the real strategy to actually achieve such a thing, and not what we are instead going to at the moment?
I think the core of the message here is, let's reassess the value we give to the way we are. So, for example, the first is manual.
Yeah.
It's like there's so much fear. Oh my God, AI is going to kill our creativity, etc. And because creativity is seen as a fundamental to defining who we are. And it's in a very narrowed perspective, right? Because creativity is really seen as an output, like an individual output of genius of some sort, right? But actually, it's broader. And I would say the most important thing that defines us as human beings is care. We care for each other. And that is through pragmatic things like the fact that we are aging society in many parts of the world. And a lot of the future jobs are very manual in a sense that you need people. You want people to carry you, to talk to you. You want to be touched. You want to be, handled with care. Service jobs, right? Which actually can really make you feel human. And we don't value them, whether it's teachers or, all these kinds of jobs. And so what happens is we've denigrated care work. And that comes from a deep, like, feminist sort of push of saying that oftentimes women are in care work, and that automatically devalues these industries. And we have evidence that it happens time and again. Teaching is a classic profession. Second, being multicultural is that, right? I mean, and I mentioned this already in the podcast about the multilingual aspect, multicultural aspect. AI can finally be able to sort of incorporate far more of the richness of our diversity. It can even revive almost dying languages, right? Because we don't have to make this draconian choice of, oh, should I learn this dominant language or not? I can create like a multiple kinds of textbooks, apps, and it's happening, by the way. It's not something in the future, it is now. Many such initiatives are happening in many parts of rural Africa, where they're literally using a printer and AI to do picture books in the indigenous local languages, and having children's books being printed just for their local area. And so they don't even have to contend with scalability, which a typical digital entrepreneur would have to do, right? So it gives us enormous amounts of empowerment and local initiative. And the third, of course, is like, there's manual, there's multicultural, and there is material, of course. I mean, material is the fact that we have a planet, it takes on resources.
Yeah.
And so we really cannot escape the fact, and it also has embodied impact because we're not out there. It's like it's part of our everyday social lives. So, when I get a joke, say I'm a refugee sitting in a camp, and I get a joke shared with me on WhatsApp from my family member, in another part of the world, and it makes me smile. It actually cheers me up, right? That is a very physical, emotional, tangible, material impact. It has improved my system internally, right? So there are multiple ways in which, not just from a personal, our body, our mind, as we know, loneliness is a growing epidemic,
Yeah.
as well as from the impact on being responsible for its impact on the planet. So these are three angles which we really need to look carefully if we want to proceed in a way which makes technologies work for us.
And I have a last question for you, as is a question I'm asking to all the guests we have on Machines That Fail Us. And I know this has been mostly about optimism, rightly so. But my question is, what is the outcome that we absolutely need to avoid when it comes to AI? So that's something we don't want to have in our future with these machines, and consequently in our future in our society. So what's the thing we need to avoid, and how to make sure that doesn't happen?
I think we need to avoid abdication of our responsibility towards technologies. I think that is so fundamental. And as I mentioned, that pessimism sediments into despair, but also impotence and learned helplessness. That what can we do now? AI is taken over, which means basically we cannot afford that. We absolutely cannot. And that means we are betraying our very human capacity to engineer change, which is in our power, our control. So I think that is really, to me, the most fundamental.
That was great. And Professor Arora, thanks for joining me today on Machines That Fail Us. It's been great talking to you. Thanks a lot.
Likewise. Thanks so much. Take care.
The Machines That Fail Us podcast is produced by the Human Error Project team in cooperation with the Communications Office of the University of St. Gallen, while the post-production is curated by Podcast Schmiede. This podcast is made possible thanks to a grant provided by the Swiss National Science Foundation Agora scheme. The next and final episode of the podcast will be released in July. You can though listen to all the episodes of Machines That Fail Us on the University of St. Gallen website, the Human Error Project website, and all major audio and podcasting platforms. This is Philip Di Salvo, and on behalf of the entire Human Error Project team, thank you for listening.